Good morning, church. A very happy Sabbath to all of you. Glad to be with you here and be able to just spend time together in worship and time together in community. As you know, we're busy with the series, and the series is called When the Game is Over, It All Goes Back in the Box. And I guess this is why we have some of these game board symbols up front here. Last week we looked at Luke chapter 2. Luke chapter 2, the story where Jesus told a story to a whole bunch of people about a rich man who invested in things in this life. And the main principle that Jesus was trying to communicate to this man is, I guess, the whole principle of when the game is over, it all goes back in the box. Everything, all the stuff that we can collect, everything that we can gather in this life, everything that we often pour our time and energy to invest in, stuff, possessions, wealth, ultimately, all of it is temporal. It doesn't last. What does last is relationships. Relationships we have nurtured or failed to nurture between people, between God, between our family, friends, and others we come in contact with. The effects and consequences of those relationships, they last into eternity. And Jesus' advice that we got from last week is invest in what is eternal. Be rich towards God. Be rich in the things that the Bible and God offer as value. And so often that involves other people. The question that we're exploring this morning, or what we want to look at, is we want to look a little bit closer and ask the question, so how are we doing at this game of life? How do we know if we are playing well or not? How do we measure? How do we keep score in the game of life? Every one of us are scorekeepers. We all crave feedback. We all want to know how we are doing, whatever it is we are doing. We all want to know if we're winning or if we're losing. Are we doing well? Are we doing okay? Keeping score is really about defining our reality. It's the way we know what counts and what doesn't count. It's a powerful thing. Keeping score. It's what directs our behavior. It's what rewards and punishes us. Every game has a way of keeping score, a way of letting you know how you're doing and where you are in the game. Remember last week I spoke about settlers. Settlers, the score is points. The first 1 to 10 points is the one who wins the game. Monopoly, you keep score by the amount of properties and the amount of money you have. Eventually, if you have the monopoly, then you win the game. In games like rugby, the score is the number of points you get from, scoring a try or getting a penalty. In soccer, it is goals. In cricket, it is runs. In every game we have, there is a score. Most of the time, you're trying to get a high score, except if you're playing golf, then you're trying to get a low score. Score gives us a sense of how we're doing, helps define us and define our reality. Question, have you ever tried to play a game and not keep score? Have you ever been in the company of one of those people that are like, nah, I don't want to keep score. Let's just do something and what's that like? In the words of my wise older brother, he'll often say, not keeping score, it's like kissing your sister. It's just not the same. It just doesn't work. It's no score. And I know there are many kids' leagues, and today one of the popular things is, with the kids playing games and playing sports without keeping score. And they've got solid reasons why they do that, but I can guarantee you every parent standing watching on the sideline knows in their minds which team has won that game. And most often, it's the team that their child is in. A question worth asking ourselves when asking how do we keep score, is who did we learn to keep score from in this life? Who taught or shaped our view of what success looks like in life? How we keep score. We see this played out in many different ways in the Bible. In the Bible, it's all about characters who, in different ways, try to keep score of life or try to find a way that they could keep score. And it starts right from the very beginning. You see, Cain, the very first son of Adam and Eve. Cain kept score by measuring his spiritualness or his acts of worship against his brothers and his brother Abel. And by measuring whether God accepted his or who was more favored spiritually, that is how Cain kept score. And eventually he became so jealous of his brother Abel when he realized or when he felt that his score, that Abel was doing better than he was, that he ended up killing his brother Abel. Then a few years later we have Jacob, who had 12 sons. Jacob had 12 sons, and they kept score by comparing which one was loved more by their father. And of course, then along came Joseph, and they sensed and felt that Joseph had more love from their father. And so eventually they caught Joseph and sold him into slavery because of their keeping score, comparing who was more loved by their father. Then we had King Saul. He kept score by looking at fame. Who was more famous? And as long as he was the one that people were singing the praises of, that the crowd was happy with, he was okay. But as soon as David killed Goliath, what happened? The crowd started singing the praises of David, and Saul became jealous. And eventually, because he was keeping score with fame, and he sensed that David was maybe doing better, he got angry and tried to kill David. Then we have the story that Jesus told last week, the parable of the rich fool. He kept score by possessions, how much he had in store. And ultimately, God said that is worth nothing. And so how do we keep score? We all have our own way. Most of us learn how to keep score from our parents. We learn how to keep score in the home. We observe and watch our parents and what they value, what they consider success, what they consider achievements in this life, what they push us towards. Then as we grow older, we look at our teachers and we maybe get an idea of score from our coaches, from our peers, and even as we go through the workforce, often from our bosses. But in some way or another, we all keep score. I want to share with you this morning just a few ways that our society, and by virtue of the fact that these are the most common ways people keep score, we often find ourselves doing the same. And the first one is by comparing. We often try and keep score of how we're doing in life by comparing ourselves with other people. We look around us and we see, you know what, how am I doing in comparison to Sue or Johnny or whoever it may be? And normally psychologists have identified that we engage in 3 types of comparison. They call it upward comparison. We look at people who are maybe a little bit further than us in life, a little bit older than us, where we want to be, upward comparison. Then we also engage in lateral comparison, people that are in our own peer group. And we also engage in downward comparison. And the interesting thing is, when we compare as a matter of score, often the comparisons we look at serve our own desires. Just to give an example of this, financially, we often engage in upward comparison. We look at people that are earning maybe a little bit more or where we want to be financially, and we look at it and we say, I want to be there. I feel the sense of entitlement, comparing myself to that person. If I can just get there, then I'll be happy, then I'll be satisfied, then I'll feel like I'm succeeding. But then, when it comes to morality, we often engage in downward comparison. That's an easy one, isn't it? We look at people that are, maybe we consider more evil than we are, or do more criminal things, or disobey more than we do, and we say, you know what, maybe I'm not so bad, because when I compare downwardly. And then, of course, when it's people in our peer group, that kind of comparison often leads to competition. And John Ortberg, in his book, and this is where we glean a lot of this material from, when the game is over, it all goes back in the box. He shared a story. Because you see, even us as pastors, this is something that we are all familiar with, that we all can't help but do in some way or another. Even pastors, when they get together and they meet at conferences, he tells about a time when he was at a conference and there were him and two other pastors, and they were busy talking. And the one said to the other one, "So, how's your church going?" Which is pastor talk for how many people come to your church. And so the other guy answered. He said, "Well, we've got about 1,000 regular attenders, and the upward trend is the trend has been upward, and it's looking quite good. How's your church going?" And so the other one responded, "Well, we've got 1,500 members that attend, and also we've just seen a huge growth, and the children's ministry department is booming, and this is happening, and financial giving is up, and it was all good." And then they looked to John Ortberg, and he knew the question that was going to come next, and they asked him, "So how's your church going?" And he said at the time he was busy pastoring a church of about 250 people. And you see, this is where this whole comparison thing leads to, because it finds us wanting to, or finding our sense of worth and value in how we match up to other people. Defining how we're doing by comparing to other people. And so he thought about it, and he thought, you know what, it will probably sound better if he said 300 people than 250. Just round it off a little bit to 300. It sounds better. They were in the thousands. He's here. He'll go 300. And then the thought went through his mind, but why would he want to sacrifice his integrity just to compare and compete with other pastors for a lousy 50 people? So he said 2,000. Then he admits he didn't really, but he was tempted to. But he said that's what comparison leads to. It leads to sacrificing your integrity to try and I guess fit in or make yourself feel more valuable with other people. And this is how often society tells us we keep score by comparison. That's one of the ways. Another way society tries to tell us we should keep score is by competing with others. These are the kind of people that need to win at whatever cost. These are the kind of people that no matter what they do in life, it seems to be a competition, whether it's going for the grocery trolley, whether it's whatever it may be. And I think this is one area that we struggled with as a family. I can't remember a time in our home when, us four brothers, we weren't competing with each other. We weren't trying to see who was the fastest. We weren't trying to outdo each other, who could jump from the highest. And it even got ridiculous. We're jumping from like 2-story buildings just to try and outdo each other. It got to who could do the most daring, dangerous stunt. We kept competing. Who got the highest score on Nintendo? Everything we did. And I find it coming into my life even now. I mean, I think I've told you this before, so it's not totally a confession, but one thing my wife and I sometimes do, if we're here in 2 different cars and we're driving home after church, we don't have to say anything to each other. We just have to get on the road, and it's a competition to see who can get home first. We try different ways, different routes, and so that can be so much a part of your life, and the reality, actually the worst one in our home, the one I think my mom hated the most, was we even used to compete about who could get to the milk first after grace had been said at the breakfast table. And I don't think there was a week that went by that milk wasn't spilt all over the table and all over the floor. Now, competing is not necessarily a bad thing. It sometimes helps us in this game of life. In any game, competition, there is a certain amount of competition that is necessary, that is useful. What we're talking about here is competition where you need to win at any cost. Where no matter what happens, no matter what you do, even if it's taking the other person out. I haven't sideswiped my wife yet while we've been driving, but it's gotten close. Even if it's taking the other person out to win. And if that desire to win and get on top is so great, it can become toxic, it can become destructive. But that's one of the ways society says we can keep score, by winning all the time in whatever we're doing. It's interesting, though, is that that's not God's way. Then the third aspect, the third way society often tells us, and this in many senses is a combination of the two I've just said, comparing and competing. And that is why we have this up here, but from everything that's been going wrong this morning, I'm a bit worried about this one. But society tells us the way we can measure how we're doing, the way we can keep score, is by climbing the ladder. Climbing the ladder, whatever that looks, or whatever the ladder is for you and I. Your ladder might be beauty. Your ladder might be work. Your ladder might be pleasure. Your ladder might be, it might even be in church. And the whole ladder principle, the whole ladder idea is that it tells us we know we are doing well by how high we are on the ladder. That is how we keep score. And we need to keep climbing, we need to keep going until we can get to the top. And one of the things that comes into this whole ladder way of keeping score is often it doesn't matter who you have to stand on, who you have to kick off, who you have to go over in order to get to the top. But as long as your goal is to reach the top of the ladder, then that is where you know you're going to be successful. You know you're going to have arrived. We live in a ladder society where everyone is trying to climb a ladder some way or another. And Sean knows I'm scared of heights, so I'm probably not going to go much further. But the interesting thing is when we look at God's way, we find something very different. And I want to invite you to turn to 2 Philippians. Philippians chapter 2. There was a 2 and there was Philippians. It made sense. Philippians chapter 2. And we'll read from verse 3. Philippians chapter 2, from verse 3, we'll eventually get to verse 8. And Paul is talking here to the church in Philippians, and he's telling them about Jesus. He's telling them about Jesus, who he was, and the significance of his life here on earth. And he starts off in verse 3, he says, don't be selfish. Don't try to impress others. What's he talking to here? This is that whole comparison. That whole comparison idea. Be humble, thinking of others as better than yourselves. Don't look out only for your own interests, but take an interest in others too. Paul immediately gets to the heart of the matter, and he says, any of the other ways or the ways society often holds up how we know we're doing or how they measure success, what the score is that we should be trying to strive for. He says, you know what the problem with a lot of those is? With comparing, competing, and climbing? Is it's all about where you want to be. It's all about your own selfish desires and motives in life. It's all about getting what you want. And so often, it means hurting, disappointing, or even destroying others in the process. And so he says, don't be selfish. Don't try and impress. And then he gives us the reason why in verse 5. You must have the same attitude that Christ Jesus had. Though he was God, He did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. Instead, he gave up his divine privileges. He took the humble position of a slave and was born as a human being. When he appeared in human form, he humbled himself in obedience to God and died a criminal's death on a cross. Did you see the progression? Picture it. Jesus is God. He's got all of heaven's privileges, all of heaven's luxuries, all of heaven's promises and goodness at his disposal. But he says Jesus did not see it fit to cling on to that equality with God. Rather, because of his love for you and I, he came down, became a man. And you know what? It probably would have been enough. All of us would probably agree that is humility enough just for Jesus to come down and be a human being. He could have, risen to the ranks here in this life. He could have had all the luxuries in this life, and that still would not compare to what he left when he came down from heaven. But he then says, no. He not only descended from heaven to earth, but then even on earth, he became a servant. He became a slave and died as one of the lowest criminals on a cross, humbling himself for you and I. He goes on and finishes later, and he says, but you know what? Because of this way of keeping score, he is now reckoned as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. He sits at the right hand of God in the throne in heaven. And you see, what Paul is talking to here, what he's trying to get us to understand, is that if we're keeping score by comparing, competing, and climbing the ladder, we might just miss Jesus because he's on his way down. He's on his way down in humility and service. Jesus spoke about this as well in Mark chapter 10, verse 35. And I invite you to turn in your Bibles there to Mark chapter 10. It's on page 607 in the Bible in the seat pocket in front of you. This is not a new phenomenon. Jesus encountered it as well. And here he's talking to his disciples. Mark chapter 10, and we'll read from verse 35. Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came over and spoke to him. Two of his disciples, some of the closest to Jesus, so I guess they felt they were in a good space with him. They could speak to him, they could trust him. And they came to Jesus and they said, "Teacher, we want you to do us a favor." Okay, when anyone asks you that question, you start wondering. They replied, "When you sit on your glorious throne, we want to sit in places of honor next to you, one on your right and the other on your left." But Jesus said to them, so do you understand what James and John are busy asking here? Okay, they've done the maths. There's 12 disciples. There's only 2 places next to a king. Okay? One day they believe Jesus is going to be king, and so here they want to preempt the other disciples. They want to try and secure their vantage point. They're busy climbing the ladder of what they believe the success in their life. They want to get right up next to Jesus onto the throne. They need to climb right past the other disciples, otherwise there's not going to be place. They're busy living the way that society often tells us to live by comparing, competing, and climbing. And they say, "Can we have places of honor right next to you when you become king?" Just, we asked first, first come, first serve. Maybe it works like that. And Jesus responds to them, "You don't know what you're asking. Are you able to drink from the bitter cup of suffering that I'm about to drink? Are you able to be baptized with the baptism of suffering I am to be baptized with?" Eagerly, "Oh yes," they replied, "we are able." Then Jesus told them, "You will indeed drink from my bitter cup, and be baptized with the baptism of suffering. But I have no right to say who will sit on my right or on my left. God has prepared those places for the ones He has chosen. Verse 41. When the 10 other disciples heard what James and John had asked, they were indignant. They were angry. So Jesus called them together and said, "You know that the rulers in this world lord it over their people, and officials flaunt their authority over those that are under them. See, this is how the world works, by comparing and competing. But among you it will be different. Whoever wants to be a leader among you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be first among you must be the slave of everyone else. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve others and to give his life as a ransom for many." Even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve others and give his life as a ransom for many. What helps followers of Jesus measure and track their progress in life? It's not comparing, competing, or climbing. Rather, it's humility, service, and sacrifice. But yet we notice in the story, and we know inside of ourselves, we know it in our own reality, that there's still this tension. There is this desire to do what God says, to be more like Jesus, to serve and love. But there's still that desire to climb. There's still that desire to achieve and have success. And what I want to say here is, you know what? Doing well in whatever you're doing well at work, being in positions of influence and power, whatever it may be, is not a bad thing. It's not wrong to have goals and to aspire and achieve. What God is talking about here is, if you define your sense of self, if you define who you are by these things, by these achievements, then that is wrong. Who we are needs to be defined by who Jesus and God is making us through the renewing of His Holy Spirit. And so we will always feel these tensions, but one thing I want to just introduce to us now as we close, and this they discovered in sports psychology quite a few years ago, but they've coined a phrase, and it's quite a biblical phrase. And the phrase was called, there's the outer game that is often played in sport. And you see, the outer game is the game that everyone sees. Let's take soccer, for example. The outer game of soccer is the skills you need on the pitch, the passing, the striking, the positioning around the field, your fitness and all of that. That is the outer game that you can work on and that can be coached and trained and directed. And that is what everyone sees when they're watching the game. But then they discovered in sports psychology that there is what they now call the inner game. And the inner game is what is not seen. The inner game is rather what happens in your mind. The inner game, you know, the outer game, there are obstacles like opponents and like your physical challenges and whatever rules the sport has, whereas the inner game, the obstacles are things like fear, anxiety, things that can't be seen, things that need. And one sports psychologist, he wrote a book and he said, the ultimate game actually in sport is not necessarily the outer game that everyone sees. Anyone can, by a certain amount of training or a certain amount of exercise, master that. What is truly necessary to make someone great is the inner game, having mastery over the inner game. Because that is when you get into tense situations, when you're under pressure, when everything seems down. That is where things like integrity, that is where things like will to go on, that is where things like fear being conquered are dealt with. And the whole goal in sports psychology now is to try and help athletes and other people conquer and master the inner game. Because so often, games are won and lost, not necessarily because of people's skill on the pitch, but because of the inner game they are fighting and dealing with in their lives. You see, the Bible talks about this idea as well. It talks about the outer and the inner man. The inner game takes place in the mind, in the soul, where we're faced with fear, doubt, anxiety, integrity, meaning, and purpose. This dimension of the game is mostly unseen, but it is the one aspect of the game that lasts and lingers on way beyond, this is now in a sportsman's case, way beyond their time as a professional sportsman has ended. The real victory is in the inner game, if that is mastered. Paul speaks about this in 2 Corinthians 4, verse 16. 2 Corinthians 4, verse 16, he says, "This is why we never give up. Though our bodies," or in some translations it says, "the outer you," are dying, our spirits, the inner you, are being renewed each and every day. The outer you is your body, your face, your hair, your eyes, your achievements, the things you can do. That is the things people see. That is the outer you. The inner you is your spirit, your soul, your character, the choices you make. The outer you is what everyone sees and what may be impressive or may not be. The inner you is invisible. The outer you can be weighed and measured and observed. The inner you is largely mystery. The outer you is temporary. It's going back in the box. The inner you is eternal. The outer you is wasting away. We don't like to think about this, but none of us can escape it. The outer you is wasting away. I started realizing that I was wasting away when I started developing these spots on my hand. And at first I thought it was cancer, and I went to my dad and I said, "Dad, have a look, what's happening to my skin? I'm developing these spots." And he just laughed and said, No, son, you're just getting old. It's fine. The outer you is wasting away. Although outwardly you'll waste away, there is an inner you, and that is what Paul says and what the Bible says really matters. In the story of Samuel and David, Samuel was given the request to go and anoint a new king in Israel. He was told to go to the house of Jesse and look at his sons. One of his sons is going to be king, and the prophet Samuel went and as he asked for Jesse's sons to come before him, many of us know the story, they started from the older, and as they walked in front of Samuel, Samuel looked and they were strong, mighty, wise men, and he thought, surely this is the one. And he went and asked God, and God said, no, it's not the one. So the next son came in, and surely this is the one. He's just as strong, just as wise. No, it's not him. Then another one came in, and Samuel, he was even taller and stronger, more stately than all the others. And Samuel thought, surely this is the one. But again, no, it's not him, until all the sons had gone past. And Samuel asked the dad, is there another son? And the dad was, none of these have, surely can't you see they're all worthy of being king? Is there another son? And eventually they had to go fetch little David, who was the younger brother who had the role of looking after the sheep. And they went and brought him before, and then Samuel got that valuable lesson that Paul is kind of referring to here, and that we often sometimes forget, is that we as humans, we notice the outside. We as humans, we often measure and try and keep score by what we see and by where people are on the ladder. But God God looks at the inside. God looks at the inner you and how that is being renewed, how that is being transformed. There's a story told of Dorian Gray. Oscar Wilde wrote the story, and this is just about a guy who was in this whole business of comparing and trying to compete and climb, and he valued his beauty. He was really a handsome man, and he was strong, and he really put all his faith and value in that, and he realized one day that this is gonna pass on. This is all temporal. And that scared him so much that he made a promise. He sold his soul so that he could stay young, that he could stay beautiful. And as the story unfolds, a famous artist drew a picture of the man, and this picture, every time he made a wrong choice or a bad decision, or his soul was corrupted by the influences that he was allowing, because he had sold his soul to stay beautiful, while it wasn't showing on the outside, this painting of him, every time he gave in morally to something that he shouldn't, it would depict in the painting what was happening in his inner being. Of course, this is a fictitious story, and Oscar Wilde was trying to make the point. And eventually one day when this guy, Dorian Gray, walked, this was late in his old age, he was still young and beautiful, but he went and found that painting up in his attic, and when he had a look at it, the contrast, when he saw the inner self, he was shocked, and he couldn't believe what had actually happened inside. Even though the outside looked fine and looked good, inside he had been deteriorating and wasting away. The reality is, for each and every one of us, it doesn't have to be that way. As Paul says in 2 Corinthians 4:16, that's why we never give up. Though our bodies are wasting away, are dying, our spirits, the inner you, are being renewed each and every day. And apparently this was more true for Paul than many of us. You see, a lot of the Bible writers write how Paul was quite, for lack of a better word, he was not very pleasant to look at. He was quite an ugly man. And so Paul might have understood this concept more than anyone else, and he had some other infirmities that inhibit him in some way. We know this from the New Testament where he was writing. And so Paul would look at his body and see how it was just deteriorating and wasting away. But for him, what was more important and what kept him going, what gave him hope, was that each and every day he declared inwardly, each and every day there was new love, new hope, new grace, new peace that comes from being in tune with God, from aligning his life with God's way of measuring and defining success. We live in a world that is obsessed with the outer, that encourages us to place our trust and value in things that just won't last. You see, we see this so often in people that try and stay young, that try, like Dorian Gray, to keep their appearance. You know, with Botox, with plastic surgery, with whatever it may be, they try and find their meaning and purpose in what their bodies or what other people see, what that looks like. But what we don't often remember, and it's often good for us to, is that is all just wasting away. And so the instruction is, take care of your body. It's a gift from God, but recognize that it is only temporary. More importantly, there is the inner you, the soul, the character that is being formed with every decision and every choice that we make. And if you want, God can be at work in the inner you. God can be renewing you, making you stronger, younger, and healthier in the inner you. In 1 John 3 verse 2, we end off with this verse. Dear friends, we are already God's children, but He has not yet shown us what we will be like when Christ appears. But we do know that we will be like Him, for we will see Him as He really is. This is what I want to encourage you with. What we do know is that we will be like Him when we see Him for who He really is. You see, when we're asking about how we keep score in this life, Christ is the measure. He is our goal. Becoming like Him, that is the inner game. That is what will last. That is eternal.